benvenuto per un momento davvero importante. Io devo ringraziare il professor Jürgen che ha accolto l'invito di essere qui oggi con noi per un momento significativo che poi ci verrà illustrato dal professor Gino Tarozzi, il conferimento della medaglia Commandiniana, ma soprattutto il professor Jürgen è uno studioso di fama internazionale e noi abbiamo avuto modo di scambiare qualche opinione, ma sicuramente si instaurerà una collaborazione tra il Max-Planck e Urbino. Tra l'altro lui è un esperto diciamo, di quel periodo così straordinario che ha caratterizzato diciamo, il Rinascimento, l'umanesimo scientifico, quindi grazie di questa presenza davvero importante. Quindi lascio la parola subito al professor Tarozzi per leggere la motivazione.
Jürgen Renn, nato l'11 luglio del 1956 a Moers, è uno storico della scienza di fama internazionale. Dal 1994 è direttore del Dipartimento I del Max-Planck-Institute für Wissenchaftgeschichte di Berlino. Renn ha studiato fisica nella Freie Università di Berlino e all'Università La Sapienza di Roma. E nel 1987 ha conseguito il dottorato in fisica matematica presso la Technische Universität di Berlino. Tra il 1986 e il 1992 ha lavorato come co-editor dei Collected Papers of Albert Einstein presso l'Università di Boston. Tra il 1991 e il 1996 ha co-diretto con Peter Damerow Arbeitsstelle Albert Einstein presso il Max-Planck-Institute for Human Development di Berlino. Nel 1993 e 1994 è stato visiting professor all'Università di Tel Aviv e l'Associate Technische School, cioè l'ETH di Zurigo. Renn è professore onorario di storia della scienza presso la Università e la Freie Universität di Berlino. Ha insegnato all'Università di Boston, all'ETH di Zurigo e all'Università Tel Aviv. È stato visiting professor presso l'Università di Vienna, Bergamo, Pavia e Caltech. È membro della Deutsche Akademie der Naturforscher Leopoldina, dell'Académie Internationale d'Histoire des Sciences. Nel 2011 ha vinto il premio Analyse Source. Nel 2014 ha vinto il ESH Neuschweizer Prize e il premio internazionale Marc Albert Hippolyte. Ha ricevuto il Max Planck Humanitas Award e il Francis Bacon Award. Al centro degli interessi di Renn c'è lo studio dell'evoluzione della conoscenza, che sarà il tema della conferenza di oggi, considerata la sua dimensione sociale, epistemica e materiale e in connessione ai processi di globalizzazione. In particolare le sue ricerche hanno riguardato lo sviluppo storico della meccanica dall'antichità fino al XX secolo. In questo ambito Renn ha studiato anche le origini della meccanica in Cina e lo scambio di conoscenza tra Europa e Cina in età moderna. Le sue ricerche si sono poi concentrate sullo studio della storia della fisica moderna, soprattutto in riferimento all'origine e allo sviluppo della teoria della relatività e della meccanica quantistica. In questo ambito ha pubblicato articoli e libri di assoluto rilievo internazionale e curato mostre importanti come Albert Einstein, Chief Engineer of the Universe. Tra le numerose pubblicazioni possiamo ricordare la serie dei volumi The Genesis of General Relativity, Sources and Interpretation, pubblicato nella prestigiosa collana Boston Studies in the Philosophy and History of Science, Springer del 2007, il libro The Road to Relativity, The History and Meaning of Einstein, The Foundations of General Relativity, Princeton University Press del 2015, e il libro Relativity, The Special and the General Theory nel 100° anniversario della teoria, cioè 2015, della teoria cioè della relatività generale, sempre Princeton University Press. Nell'ambito di questi suoi importanti studi sull'origine e gli sviluppi della meccanica, Renn si è specificamente occupato della scuola commandiniana, sulla quale ha pubblicato un bellissimo testo scritto con Peter Damerow, The Equilibrium Controversy, Ubaldo del Monte's Critical Notes on the Mechanics of Giordano and Benedetti and their Historical and Conceptual Background, edition Open Access Berlino, 2012. Fin dagli esordi del World Wide Web, Renn ha sostenuto il libero accesso alle fonti storiche. Nel 1992 ha lanciato un'iniziativa con Peter Damerow e Paolo Gallusti per creare un archivio elettronico Galileo Einstein accessibile online gratuitamente. Con il sostegno della comunità europea, in seguito ha fondato l'iniziativa ECO, European Cultural Heritage Online, per promuovere lo studio delle fonti storiche online. È stato inoltre uno dei promotori della Berlin Declaration on Open Access to Knowledge in the Science and Humanities, lanciando la piattaforma editoriale Edition Open Access insieme ad altri colleghi della Max-Planck Society. Attraverso tali progetti di digitalizzazione, i manoscritti del Commandini e dei suoi allievi, contenuti presso il fondo antico della Biblioteca Universitaria di Urbino e presso la Biblioteca Oliveriana di Pesaro, sono oggi patrimonio di tutti gli studiosi, essendo stati digitalizzati attraverso la collaborazione del nostro Ateneo con il Max-Planck-Institute e resi disponibili online. Quindi per tutte queste ragioni, appunto, poi il Rettore leggerà la motivazione breve, poi sono stato un po' prolisso, ma per quanto abbia cercato di sintetizzare, avete visto il lavoro di Jürgen è così profondo e articolato che non sono riuscito a contenerlo a durata di un'ora.
To Jürgen Renn for his fundamental contribution to our understanding of the evolution of scientific thought, especially of the origin and development of mechanics up to Einstein. Contribution due not only to his own research, but to the vigorous promotion and direction of collective research projects. Bene, grazie. Ora il professor Jürgen ci parlerà di Evolution of Knowledge. Prego.
Ecco, al lavoro. Gentili colleghe e colleghi, care amiche, cari amici, grazie per essere qui oggi con me a ricordare Federico Commandino e la sua eredità culturale di dimensione internazionale. Grazie per avermi offerto l'occasione di venire ad Urbino a festeggiare con voi, vostro illustre concittadino, onorandomi con una medaglia che è per me motivo di profonda gioia e gratitudine. Desidero ringraziare vivamente il magnifico rettore dell'Università di Urbino, professore Direktor Stocchi, gli illustri colleghi dei seguenti centri e dipartimenti: Centro Interuniversitario di Ricerca in Filosofia e Fondamenti della Fisica, Centro Interuniversitario Urbino e la Prospettiva, Dipartimento di Scienze Pure e Applicate, Dipartimento di Economia, Società e Politica, l'illustre professore Marco Cangiotti, gli amici e illustri professori e colleghi Gino Tarozzi, Vincenzo Fano, Gianita Lobischi, Enrico Gamba, Pierluigi Graziani. Desidero inoltre ringraziare la città di Urbino e tutta la sua cittadinanza che nel corso degli anni ha sempre accompagnato con grande affetto e generosità le collaborazioni di ricerca tra il mio istituto e le istituzioni che hanno sede ad Urbino. Urbino è per noi, una naturale e permanente capitale della cultura, un riferimento imprescindibile per la ricchezza della sua storia artistica, scientifica, tecnologica, per la vivacità e l'intelligenza con la quale ha sempre curato la sua storia e quella dei protagonisti del Rinascimento artistico e scientifico. Figure come quelle di Federico Commandino, Milobaldo del Monte, Bernardino Baldi e tanti altri costituiscono un pantheon d'eccezione per tutti gli studiosi di storia della scienza. Negli ultimi anni la scuola urbinate ha saputo valorizzare a livello internazionale la ricchezza di questo suo patrimonio, che è patrimonio dell'umanità e incentivo per noi a impegnarci nella sua salvaguardia e nel suo sviluppo, sostenendo ricerche innovative, soprattutto rivolte ai giovani studiosi. La medaglia Commandino è per me un segno della vivacità della scuola urbinate attuale, della sua capacità di riaffermare la centralità degli studi rivolti alla storia del sapere e alle sue connessioni con la comunità che quel sapere sa esprimere e nutrire. Una comunità che fa crescere la conoscenza e la trasforma in un crogiolo di originalità e curiosità intellettuale, di condivisione dei talenti e di coraggio delle idee. Idee che sanno farsi strada fuori dai terreni battuti, a dispetto dei luoghi comuni e delle pigrizie intellettuali. L'opera e l'impegno di amici e colleghi come Gino Tarozzi, Vincenzo Fava, Gianita Lobischi, Enrico Gamba, Pierluigi Graziani dà a me, a noi colleghi d'Oltralpe, speranza e coraggio. Grazie ancora a tutti voi per l'amicizia e per l'onore che questa medaglia porta con sé. Vengo ora alla mia relazione, che sarà in inglese, con qualche interpolazione italiana, per dare un carattere più aperto e internazionale a questo particolare momento della cerimonia che avete così generosamente preparato. Ecco, allora vediamo se funziona. Humans have changed the planet. Actually, humans have changed massively the planet with dramatic consequences. There is virtually no untouched nature anymore. A large part of the Earth's surface, not covered by ice, has been transformed by humans. The polar ice is melting, the water level of the oceans rises, and coastal and marine habitats have undergone massive changes. More than half the available freshwater resources are being exploited by humans. Oceans are being acidified and contaminated by aquacultures. Agricultural soils are being degraded. The underground has been changed by mines and drilling. The construction of thousands of dams and extensive deforestations massively affect water circulation and erosion rates, and thus the evolution and geographical spread of numerous species. The loss of biodiversity is by orders of magnitudes larger than without human interventions. On average, at least every third nitrogen atom in the biosphere has once been processed by the fertilizer industry. Most of the biomass of all living mammals is constituted by the biomass of humans and the animals domesticated by them. Humans have brought new materials into circulations, such as elemental aluminium, lead, cadmium, mercury, which had been rare under natural conditions. Fly ash residues from the high temperature combustion of coal and oil, but also concrete, plastic, and other man-made materials, many of them display new properties different from those of natural materials. Plutonium from atmospheric nuclear testing will persist in the sedimentary record for the next several 100,000 years, while it decays into uranium and then into lead. We are measuring the highest atmospheric concentrations of the greenhouse gases carbon dioxide and methane since at least 800,000 years. Even if the use of fossil energy resources would immediately be stopped, it would take thousands of years before that concentration would sink to pre-industrial values. Some of the changes have happened on a much faster time scale than natural processes. The present concentration of carbon dioxide has been reached at a rate at least 10 or possibly 100 times faster than increases at any time during the last 420,000 years. At the same time, new diseases may spread as their carriers have rapid life cycles, allowing them to quickly adapt to the new conditions. how quickly will human societies be able to adapt to the new conditions? The ongoing changes will affect, in any case, different parts of the globe in different measures. With floods increasingly menacing cities near to water, new forms of gentrification emerge, raising the prices of dry and secure locations and displacing the poor. Previously fertile farmlands dry out because of lacking rain, inducing allocation battles and migrations into richer nations. All in all, it seems that developed countries may temporarily gain from climate change, while developing countries will surely suffer. In short, the planet, our planet, is changing with irreversible consequences. There is no hope that we might ever be able to return to some natural state of affairs. Humanity does not act on the backdrop of an unchangeable nature, but is deeply woven into its very fabric, shaping both its imminent and its distant futures. The fundamental revision of our understanding of the state of this planet may only be compared with the upheaval of the physical conceptions of space and time in the sequel of Einstein's theories of relativity. And given the nice poster that you have prepared, Einstein cannot lack in this. Einstein non può mancare in questa conferenza, ovviamente, ma mi limito a questo breve riferimento. In classical physics, space and time seem to be a rigid stage, un palcoscenico, on which world events were taking place. According to Einstein's theory, in contrast, this stage is no longer an immutable framework, but is itself rather part of the drama, since there is no absolute distinction between the actors and the scenery. Space and time do not remain in the background of physical processes, but rather take part in them. The new situation of the Earth confronts us with a similarly radical need for rethinking our situation. We are not living in a stable environment that just serves as a stage and gives us resources for our actions, but we are all actors in a comprehensive drama in which humans and the non-human world equally take part. In the year 2000, the Nobel Prize winner and discovery of the hole in the ozone layer of the atmosphere, Paul Crutzen, sì, magari tutti sposti un attimo. Mi sembra che sia questo. Ecco, speriamo perché ce ne sono tanti diapositivi. Questo è Paul Crutzen. He felt uneasy with the current official account of the state of the planet, according to which we are currently living in the Holocene. Geologists have a sophisticated system to organize the enormous time span of the Earth's history into intervals. The Holocene means entirely recent and is the second epoch of the so-called Quaternary period. It may sound strange, but the Quaternary is actually an ice age which began 2.6 million years ago. More precisely, it is characterized by a back and forth of polar ice. The Holocene is an interglacial period where the ice retreats. It began at the end of an anomalous cooling period that interrupted the post-glacial warming dated by radiocarbon to between approximately 12,900 and 11,500 years before the present. Its temperatures have been strikingly stable for more than 11,000 years, from then to the present. Crutzen was participating in a conference on the Earth system science outside Mexico City when he was struck by a sudden dislike for the label Holocene, which seemed to utterly belittle the human impact of the Earth system. He told the delegates to stop using the term Holocene and while he was speaking, searched for a better theme. We are not in the Holocene, we are in the Anthropocene. As it turned out, the term Anthropocene had been used by the limnologist Eugene F. Sturmer since the 1980s, and similar terms have been introduced independently by several scientists. Its roots go back even to the 18th century, when the French naturalist Buffon remarked, and I quote, that the entire face of the earth bears the impact of human power. Its current centrality for a broad discourse on planetary changes and humanity's role in them are, however, connected with that crucial moment in the year 2000. Crutzen himself and scholars of many disciplines have since controversially discussed the Anthropocene, its meaning for understanding humanity's predicament, but also its viability as a geological time period. It has since been examined by the Anthropocene Working Group, and you see many members of the Anthropocene Working Group here, and formally proposed, after 7 years of intense study, to the subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy, which in turn reports to the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which is responsible to the International Union of Geological Sciences. So you see there's a complicated hierarchy in the geological sciences as well. But whatever the final decision of the geological experts may be, the concept of the Anthropocene has opened our eyes towards a fundamentally changed global environment, and the fact that humanity has meanwhile changed the planet to a degree that is comparable to geological forces. So faccio così. Ti puoi spostare un po'? No, si è spento, no? No, vabbè. Given the massive impact of human intervention in the planetary environment, the traditional dividing lines between nature and culture have become problematic, as we are living in a second nature resulting from these interventions, as Karl Marx has formulated it. Also, the time scale of human history has become intrinsically meshed up with the geological time scale. Our economic metabolism feeds on fossil energy, consuming resources within a time span of hundreds of years that have been created over hundreds of millions of years. And just as geological time is turned into historical time, our impact as a geological force turns human history into a significant part of geological history. Who destroys our planet? Who destroys our planet? The transformative power of humanity is evidently based on knowledge, accumulated over generations. What has also accumulated, however, are the unintended consequences of human actions. Nobody seriously intended to destroy our planet. Specifically, science and technology have contributed much to bring us into this situation. Global industrialization, traffic, and population growth would not be possible without the advances of science and technology. They have catapulted us from the age of horse-drawn plows or carriages to the age of industrialized agriculture and self-driving cars. And they have blessed us with the unequally distributed opportunities of modern medicine. But along with their progress, they have generated uncontrolled growth, the ruthless exploitation of natural resources, and a rapid increase of greenhouse emissions changing the global climate. And while humans are capable to send missions into interplanetary space, or to build self-driving cars or airplanes, they have not yet found ways to prevent billions from a fate of poverty or even starving, to contain wars, let alone to cope with the challenges of the Anthropocene for humanity as a whole. True, these are political and economic questions, and not just questions of knowledge. But, I would claim, they are also questions of knowledge. science in the Anthropocene Rethinking science in the Anthropocene means to ask a number of fundamental questions about science and knowledge, as well as about their historical evolution. In this talk, I proceed in 5 steps. I have already begun to discuss the double character of knowledge crucial for our entry into the Anthropocene, the empowerment it provides, and the unintended consequences it leads to, which I shall briefly recapitulate below. This is the first step. In the second step, I shall discuss the historical nature of thinking and ask how knowledge structures change. In the third part, dedicated to the economy of knowledge, I shall investigate how knowledge structures affect society and how society affects knowledge structures. In the fourth part, I shall analyze diffusion and globalization processes of knowledge, asking how knowledge spreads. Finally, in the fifth part, I shall come back to the theme of the Anthropocene, discussing its emergence on the background of evolutionary considerations and asking the question of on what knowledge does our future depend. Cioè in altre parole io vi guido su un paio di questioni fondamentali ricordando la storia non solo della scienza ma anche la storia del sapere e vi presento un po' la cornice teorica entro la quale noi all'Istituto Max-Planck proseguiamo le nostre ricerche. E tutto questo come diciamo, riferimento a questi grandi argomenti che vi ho esposto in questo momento. Allora cerchiamo passo per passo un po' di andare tra questi argomenti. Riassumo brevemente il tema dell'Anthropocene e poi parlerò un po' delle strutture e delle architetture del sapere. Let me once more recapitulate the role of knowledge in and for the Anthropocene. Humans have massively intervened in various Earth system cycles, such as the carbon cycle causing climate change, as well as the water, nitrogen, phosphorus and sulfur cycles, all of which are fundamental to life on Earth. Humanity has affected the energy balance at the Earth's surface, resulting in the transition of our planet into a new stage, propelled and empowered by the knowledge embodied in our technologies and our material culture. The question of whether and when the Anthropocene began is currently hotly debated. Some say in the Neolithic era, some say in the Industrial Revolution, and some say in the process of the great acceleration that you can see illustrated here after the war in the 1950s. The human species has mushroomed all over the planet. With all its interventions in planetary cycles, it is still part of the biosphere, with no power to transcend it. We are not outside observers. What distinguishes us from the rest of the biosphere is cultural evolution, a new layer of metabolism and learning on top of biological evolution. While they're rapidly evolving, with their rapidly evolving culture, humans have introduced a new sphere. Some call it technosphere. I prefer to call it ergosphere from the Greek word of ergon, work, as a new global component of the Earth system, in addition to the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the biosphere, thus changing the overall dynamics of the Earth system. Unwisely, we have left the astonishingly stable state of the Anthropocene, which has shaped our culture and our ways of thinking. The Anthropocene may be a non-analog state of the Earth system, but it will not necessarily mean the demise of humanity. We just do not yet know what it holds in stock for us. When leaving our Holocenic bubble, we are not uprooting a static nature, but we are intervening within a system that is itself highly dynamic. We are performing a global experiment on a system that is already changing itself. Our interventions, one could say, are therefore producing second-order changes. As a consequence, we have made ourselves, and this is my main conclusion, we have made ourselves ever more dependent on our understanding of these complex systems and our interaction with it. this understanding is itself not static but subject to a dynamical evolution. Understanding the dynamics of knowledge is therefore crucial for our survival in the Anthropocene. Both knowledge and the changes of the environment accumulate across generations in long-term processes, but not necessarily so that human survival is guaranteed. So this is, my motivation why I think what we are doing as historians and philosophers of science is actually relevant to those big questions of the Anthropocene. So this is a brief rehash here. Another one. Wow. But what is knowledge? This question brings me to my second part. Individual knowledge is based on encoding experiences enabling individuals to solve problems as part of their adaptive behavior. It is rooted in the capability of anticipating actions, and their results can be corrected in response to the consequences of these actions, since we can reflect on our experiences. Due to the dependence of knowledge on prior experience, its predictive power is always limited, of course. On the other hand, knowledge can be mentally stored in the form of cognitive structures and repurposed for new goals. Although we are describing such, or I will be describing such cognitive structures of human thinking just on the phenomenological levels, without going into the neurological basis, we observe a number of remarkable aspects, and I will summarize these aspects for you. One of these aspects is that the structures and contents of knowledge are in general not as in the structures, le strutture e i contenuti sono in generale non così indipendenti uno dall'altro as a long tradition separating logic from meaning has believed. Any concept, for instance, the concept of a tree, may specifically refer to a concrete experience, to a tree that I have just seen, but at the same time act as a general cognitive structure to which this experience can be assimilated, connecting it with a web of other experience. So I have a little tree theory in my head when I see a tree and I connect the specific tree to it. Every concept is indeed like a little theory. Cognitive structures are active in the sense that they change with every implementation. If I see a tree I've never seen before, I may change my concept of a tree and thus the entire network of semantic relations in which this concept is embedded. This is a fundamental feature of cognitive development that also accounts, and therefore I think it's important, for how scientific knowledge may change due to novel experiences. In particular, when these novel experiences are hard to digest, taking the form of what I call challenging objects. For example, when one expects that all physical interactions require direct contact between bodies, the invisible forces moving the needle of a compass or making the apple fall down from the already mentioned tree may appear miraculous, as they did for the young Einstein, who remembered this encounter with the compass as a challenging object for all his life. Cognitive structures allow for thinking process even under circumstances of incomplete information, which is mostly our predicament. Lacking information in parts of the structure may be supplemented by information resulting from prior experience in the form of default assumptions, such as when I only see the upper part of a tree and conclude that it must have a root, because trees normally have roots, I of course assume every tree has a root. But even if it turns out that the root has been cut, I do not have to abandon my conviction that I'm still dealing with a tree. Surrealist art plays with our default assumptions. Vladimir Kusch, for example, baffles us by painting a sailing ship carrying butterflies where we expect it to have sails according to our mental models of such a ship. We have a default setting when we see a ship, assuming that a sailing ship has sails, of course, and not butterflies. So how is this relevant for scientific understanding? The availability of default settings And the possibility of flexibly replacing them is an important factor also for scientific heuristics, helping us to understand why scientific theories normally do not have to be given up in the face of contrary evidence. La teoria della falsificazione in questo senso è molto problematica, because it is sufficient often to replace some default settings while keeping the essential argumentative structure. Incomplete scientific information is typically complemented by background knowledge consisting of default assumptions rooted in prior knowledge. When Galileo saw a blurry picture of the moon in his self-made telescope, he could identify its irregularities as craters and mountains due to his prior experience with landscape images and his expectation to see another Earth-like body. The components of a cognitive structure, ci vuole concentrazione, questo è il punto, may be given by other cognitive structures, as when the concept of a house is explicated in terms of its elements, basement, floor, roof, walls, windows. With each of these concepts, for instance, the concept of the door, in turn being expandable in terms of its components, such as the doorknob, joints, lock, wood panel, paint, etc. Cognitive structures are thus somewhat like Russian dolls, with a nested sequence of other cognitive structures inside. But these hierarchies are not fixed, so that one could also start from inside the box, so to say, expanding it in another direction. For instance, when starting from the concept of a wood panel and finding inside its Russian doll sequence, the example of a door made out of wooden panels, among many other things. In other terms, we can speak of semantic networks that may be arranged in different hierarchies. Altering such hierarchies is in fact another salient feature of conceptual change in science. An originally marginal concept may eventually find itself at the center of a new conceptual system. Inertial motion, for instance, had long been noted when a projectile leaves a hurling motion of a slingshot along a straight line. But only with classical mechanics it became the anchor point of a conceptual system. So it's not that before Galileo nobody observed inertial motion, it's just it didn't become a central feature of a conceptual system. We refer to these complex interdependencies as the architecture of knowledge. Two further general features are important. There is a certain layered structure to this architecture due to the fact that some experiences, such as those of our moving around in this material world, are rather basic and persistent. Lifting heavy objects requires effort. Rigid walls are hard to penetrate, usually. These underlying layers of intuitive knowledge often provide default settings for expectations when entering a new terrain or when dealing with less concrete matters, where they often reappear as metaphors. The other general observation is that people strive for a mental representation of their world that seems rather complete to them. To some extent, all of us are aware, of course, of some of our blind spots, but we nevertheless tend to avoid an epistemic vacuum. Complementing our partial knowledge of the world with default assumptions, striving for a more or less holistic view of the world around us. By the way, I think this is one of the problems underlying much of the political and ideological controversies. Everybody, you can observe it even in children, thinks to have a complete picture of the world. And it's really hard to convince people that they have white spots in this picture. So much for the mental part of knowledge. But knowledge has not just mental, and this is very important, not just mental, but also material and social dimensions. It can be stored, shared, and passed on from individual to individual and across generations with the help of external representations, which are part of the material culture of society. The material culture not only determines a horizon of possible actions and forms of social organization, but also a horizon of thinking. The emergence of the concept of energy, for instance, became only possible once actual transformations of motive power, for instance the replacement of human force by wind or water power, and later by the steam ages, historically emerged as material practices. So first the practices, and then the reflection on these practices, which gave rise to those abstract concepts. External representations, such as writing or symbol systems, and here you see some of the earliest examples of the history of writing, serve as paper tools, as we sometimes say, to support reflection in the sense of thinking on thinking, because it's much easier to think on thinking once thinking becomes represented externally in such a form. Reflecting on actions with such external representations, for instance on signs representing objects to be counted, like those little counters you see there on the left, may engender higher order forms of knowledge, for instance an abstract concept of number, a process which we sometimes call, following Piaget, reflective abstraction. These higher order forms of knowledge may seem to be decoupled from the primary object of experience, as if they were living in some kind of a Platonic world. But actually, they remain related to these basic experiences by historically specific knowledge transformations, which we can follow as historians of science. The resulting abstract concepts, such as the concept of number, of energy, of a chemical element, or of gene, serve to integrate numerous experiences within a conceptual system. For instance, the conceptual system of thermodynamics or of modern biology. But all of these concepts remain liable to further change. That's very important. Knowledge is typically part Knowledge is typically part of a system of knowledge. An example is the curriculum of a medieval university with its faculties of theology, medicine, and jurisprudence. So remind you, this is electrostatically charged. Prepared by the prior study of the 7 liberal arts. Another example is the modern system of the scientific disciplines. Systems of knowledge in our sense do not have to be conceptual systems integrated by abstract categories, as in the examples I just mentioned. In fact, they do not have to be very systematic at all. The knowledge to build a house or to tender a garden may also be conceived as a system of knowledge composed of many different elements of knowledge. These elements are not held together by a strict organizational principle, but rather constitute a heterogeneous package of knowledge. The relation among the components of a system of knowledge, they may be semantic, like in a scientific theory, they may be institutional, as in a curriculum, or they may be practical, as in the example of a building project. Scientific knowledge is a special form of knowledge, involving not just theories, but also cultural practices. It first emerged in complex societies that created social spaces for exploring knowledge independent from immediate practical purposes. And I think that's what I would propose as a historical definition of science, to explore the potential of a society independent from immediate practical needs. And hence you can follow it back down to the first appearance of the division of intellectual and manual labor. Nobody could anticipate for a very long time that human societies would eventually become dependent on precisely such an esoteric form of knowledge. Scientific knowledge is accumulated and transmitted by epistemic communities, dealing often within dedicated institutions with the preservation and generation of such knowledge. We may speak of science, for instance, whenever the potential inherent in the material or symbolic culture of a society is being explored for the primary sake of knowledge generation. Scientific knowledge is rooted, of course, in other forms of knowledge, such as practical knowledge, but is encoded typically in special ways, including writing as an important medium. Scientific practices comprise forms of initiation, education, exploration, discourse, and transmission, which are all subject to historical changes. Historically variable forms of argumentative standards and control structures for the validation of knowledge shape its accumulation and corrigibility, extending the learning and self-correcting aspect of individual knowledge to a societal institution. So the claim is not that there are absolute standards for what is a scientific theory, what is a correct scientific assertion, but all of these standards are changing as well. But they typically have this feature of trying to carry the individual aspects of knowledge, the corrigibility of knowledge, to an institutional form. The form which scientific knowledge takes also depends on the role a society assigns to knowledge, or its image of knowledge, and the criteria applied to its validation. Scientific systems of knowledge are subject to persistent change in long-term processes of accumulation, loss, and transformation, which may occasionally give rise to far-going reorganizations of both the new architecture of knowledge, and the relevant epistemic community. So the change of science always involves the conceptual structure and, of course, the social and institutional structure. Some of these transformation processes are traditionally called scientific revolutions. Actually, however, they, in my conviction, do not result from paradigm shifts, but rather from more complex knowledge transformations, such as the exploration of an existing system of knowledge to its limits, which may give rise to a matrix for the emergence of a new system. So the new emerges from a transformation of the old. Such a reorganization of knowledge systems opens up new perspectives and also possibilities for disruptive societal change, sometimes, that cannot be predicted by any linear model of scientific and technological progress. For this reason alone, focusing, as it might seem from my introduction, that I'm arguing for focusing now all resources on applied research solving humanity's big problem. But given that such a linear model doesn't apply, it makes little sense. Grand challenges do not automatically generate grand solutions, and changes of perspectives or disruptive innovations can hardly be anticipated. That's the fundamental dilemma of science, I believe. We need it urgently to solve our problem, but we cannot easily direct all the resources in the direction of the problems we want to solve. So we are now at the third part of my lecture, where I deal more systematically with the relation between knowledge and society. So I require a little patience of you, because I'm going through all of the big themes here. This is my offer to you, but you have to be patient. Here I describe and analyze the relation between society and knowledge as two aspects of a common dynamics shaping human existence. A key mechanism of the interdependence of interdependence of knowledge and society is what I call an entrapment of mutual limitation. Entrapment of mutual limitation. What I mean with this? I mean that on the one hand, the mental and cognitive development of individuals is limited by the experiential horizon a society offers to them, the given historical situation. While in turn, societal regulations, institutions, rules, are constrained by the limited range of individual mental capabilities and perspectives. So this is a vicious cycle. Societies form individuals and impose rules, and individuals can limit in turn what kind of rules a society can establish. This interdependence also shapes the capability of individuals and society to maintain complex forms of cognitive and social organization, withstanding the always present temptation of self-destruction. Self-destruction is always the easiest answer to all these problems, of course. So we have to resist this. Societal changes necessarily involve, therefore, a co-evolution of social and mental structures, not just knowledge, but also knowledge. Just as the technology of material practices allows for the formation of scientific abstractions, like I mentioned before, the concept of energy, number concept, and so on. Societal practice, like administrations or the markets, also may give rise to cultural abstractions, such as the concept of time and economic value. External representations of these cultural abstractions, such as clocks or money, may in turn become a starting point for a new social regulation and development, such as the rise of capitalism. With the increasing societal role of information technologies, data have come to play a key role as a cultural abstraction steering societal and economic processes. You just data a new form of capital. Cultural abstractions shape our thinking and our social existence. They are not easy to change, but because they are the result of this complex evolution and iterative processes. But as the history of science shows, think of the great examples, Einstein changing the concept of space and time, one can change those mechanisms and those cultural abstractions as well. While all abstractions tend to be opaque with regard to the historically specific experience from which they emerged, we tend to forget from which experiences they have actually emerged. They may be challenged by new experiences. In the history of science, such challenges have triggered major upheavals of fundamental concepts such as space, time, matter, energy, and so on. In societal development, the experiences and challenges of the Anthropocene may also warrant new cultural abstractions as regulatory mechanisms for coping with problems of planetary boundaries and limited resources. They may help us to regulate, for instance, the carbon dioxide balance of the Earth system. I'm here referring to the certificates and to new forms of expressing this ecological economics. Every society has its knowledge economy. It designates the ensemble of its social institutions and processes, producing and reproducing knowledge at its disposal, and in particular, the knowledge on which the reproduction of a society relies. The external representations available to a society, and in particular its knowledge representation technologies, be they papyrus, parchment, paper, or the web, critically shape its knowledge economy. Think of the role of the printing press for the Reformation, just one image. The action potential of a society, for instance in reaction to external challenges, crucially depends on its knowledge economy. While new knowledge enables individuals to plan their actions and think about the result, a society cannot think, but only anticipate the consequences of its action within its economy of knowledge. That's our predicament of collective action. That's the problem. The capability of the global human society to cope with the challenges of the Anthropocene will therefore critically depend on the development of its knowledge economy. The production of scientific knowledge is regulated by a knowledge economy separate from the immediate needs of societal reproduction. That's its essence. Yet it has become an existential condition for global society. The internal regulation of this separate knowledge economy, as well as the interfaces shaping the societal implementation of scientific knowledge, have, by the same token, also become critical factors of humanity's capability of coping with the Anthropocene. Given the unpredictability and serendipity of innovations, it would be short-sighted to bend the practice of science to primarily deal with the challenges at hand. It would be equally risky, on the other hand, to maintain the self-inflicted fragmentation of knowledge characteristic of the current economy of science, driven by competition for real and symbolic capital. The fragmentation of scientific knowledge due to interdisciplinary specialization and compartmentalization, traditional publication venues, commercialization, impact factors, age factors, and so on and so forth, may actually hinder opportunities for knowledge integration and implementation, blocking urgently needed innovations. The web, the World Wide Web, on the other hand, offers a knowledge representation technology. I have talked about the Reformation and the Renaissance and the role of the printing press, with the potential of optimizing the current knowledge economy towards a global co-production of knowledge and new forms of organizing, integrating, locally adapting, and implementing scientific knowledge. A web of knowledge. Now I have one second. No problem. Everything is right. A web of knowledge or an epistemic web would help to balance asymmetries in the ownership and control of knowledge and also allow users to become prosumers, for instance by replacing browsers with interfaces optimized for interacting with the global human knowledge represented on the web. Not only contents, but also the network of links would have to become openly accessible. As elogio molto gentile diceva, mi sono impegnato per open access. But open access we may even succeed, but there is so much information in the links, and the links are the digital capital that is privately held and not accessible to us. A new representation technology would have to co-involve with a new economy of scientific knowledge. It would have to include a reward system, replacing the pseudo-capitalism of the academic world. That is, its focus on symbolic capital instead of the actual knowledge needed and generated. On an epistemic web, this knowledge would be directly accessible, traceable, and reviewable. This transparency would also enhance the trust in the cooperation with other societal players. And trust is a big issue these days. Globally sharing and co-producing knowledge may also help to overcome the entrapment of mutual limitation that I mentioned earlier through the opening up of new experiential spaces. So my fourth part, rather quickly, will deal with the spread of knowledge and the mechanisms of knowledge transfer. This is a map of the presumed spread of writing, probably by stimulus dissemination from its origin in Babylonia and Egypt to the world, with of course the Mesoamerican writing being an independent development. But there's a strong hint that all of these developments in one form or the others are connected. So it's very important to realize that the globalization of knowledge is a very old process, and this is what I want to argue for. And it is a layered process. In the course of history, globalization processes have created sediments, such as the global spread of basic technologies, food production in the neolithization process, writing, and they change conditions for subsequent globalization. But due to the crucial role of knowledge in globalization processes, including its role, the role of knowledge, in forming the identity of its actors, they do not necessarily lead to a homogenization, to a flat world. Knowledge transfer always involves an active appropriation on the receiving end, associated with the generation of new local knowledge. So we have analyzed this in detail, and I will rush through this for the case of knowledge transfer to China, where you can see knowledge was not just received but transformed in the process, fed into a completely differently constructed knowledge economy. Here's where the term knowledge economy is really helpful to understand what goes wrong or what is being transformed in such a process. And the history of science cannot be understood, for instance, without understanding the many, many translation processes, which are always knowledge transformation processes, which have shaped the global history of knowledge. And there is an interesting aspect in these transformation processes to which I would like to draw your attention. And this I call cultural refraction. In the sense of an explication of structures of knowledge in a different medium implicit in the source economy of knowledge. And the wonderful example is the transfer of knowledge from the Babylonian and Egyptian world to the Greek context. In the context of the disputation culture of ancient Greece, structures of practical knowledge of Babylonian and Egyptian origin were encoded in writing and made the object of explicit reflection. They had to be justified because they were taken out of context, so people had to argue about them. This is where concepts like proofs and the deductive structures originated. This is a cultural refraction. Cultural refraction may thus foster the emergence of higher order knowledge with a greater independence from local contexts and local conditions. And again, modern science is the result of a long-term global history of knowledge due to the formation of sediments of globalization processes and the cultural refractions just described. The so-called Western science, there's a lot of debate, Western science versus other forms of science, And I think it's actually global science, in two senses. It is a product of global history, and now global history depends on it. The globalization of knowledge in history is driven by an intertwinement of intrinsic and extrinsic processes. With intrinsic process, I mean the unfolding of knowledge systems with new experiences that are being integrated. And the extrinsic processes is because knowledge is, of course, part of colonization processes, part of conquest, part of commercial activities. So in one word, it's very often a fellow traveler of these extrinsic processes. But both are closely intertwined in ways that you can easily imagine. Now, interesting maybe for you is that concentration. No, wrong direction. Doesn't, yeah, very good. Interesting for you maybe that, there are new ways of describing this spread of knowledge, and we sometimes speak of epistemic networks. The example here comes from my colleague Matteo Ragliani, and it shows how some navigational knowledge from the Portuguese seafarers traveled through Europe and then became part of a Europe-wide network of treatises that replicated this knowledge and exchanged this knowledge, and eventually it stabilized in such a network. We analyze that the network language is a good language for understanding the co-evolution I mentioned earlier of those semantic networks, which I began my lecture, and the social networks, and of course the network of treatises or what I call external representations. And if you really want to understand how these processes work, you can study the interaction between the semantic, the social, and the material networks here. And you understand in detail, including the application of mathematical models and social network theory, how such processes work. And this, I think, is a new branch of the history of science. So let me come rather quickly back in my fifth part to the relation between the Anthropocene and the evolution of knowledge. The entry into a new state of the Earth system is not due to a single cause and cannot be tied to a particular event in human history, I claim. Remember that discussion. This is again the great acceleration. Here you have some of the socio-economic processes and here some of the Earth processes, and they are strongly coupled, evidently, because you see strong so-called hockey stick curves, both on the socio-economic changes, telecommunication, transportation, whatever you have, and changes in the Earth system. Clearly, the great acceleration has been, a threshold. But if you want to follow through when the Anthropocene actually began, you cannot just pin it down to such a single fact. I think it can best be described in terms of a cascade of evolutionary processes, and more precisely as a transition from cultural evolution to what I call epistemic evolution. Let me try to explain. In cultural evolution, human societies have entered relations of production dependent on their material culture. In epistemic evolution, human societies have entered interaction with the Earth system dependent on science-based technologies such as the use of fossil fuels, nuclear power, artificial fertilizers, or genetic engineering. Without the empowerment of the means of production through scientific knowledge, humanity would have neither entered nor be able to survive in the Anthropocene. Once the knowledge economy of science entered a positive feedback loop with capitalist economy, a runaway effect transformed cultural evolution into a process ever more dependent on science-based technologies. What stone tools, hunting, gathering, and later food production, clothing, and the building of shelters were for the Holocene, science and technology are for the Anthropocene, namely essential conditions of human life as we know it. Of course, biologically we might not survive as a species, but nothing recognizable as human culture probably without these instruments. The transition from cultural to epistemic evolution suggests to consider the development of knowledge as an important part of cultural evolution, and cultural theories have often neglected this aspect. In the transition from biological to cultural evolution, the role of niche construction, e.g. beavers constructing their dams, had been transformed from an aspect of biological evolution, where it has always been observed as niche construction is a feature of evolutionary biology, but now in cultural evolution it has become an essential feature, as the role of the material culture and tool use for the very emergence of humans may illustrate. In the transition from cultural to epistemic evolution, the role of scientific knowledge has been similarly turned from an aspect, from a marginal aspect, into a characteristic feature of the novel evolutionary dynamics. But which role does knowledge play in cultural evolution? The direction in which science and technology develop is not fixed, and certainly not governed by a rigid logic of progress. Their development is rather subject to an interplay between cognitive and contextual factors that includes other forms of knowledge as well. The experiment we are performing with our planet generates both massive changes of the environment and new knowledge. Therefore, we have to better understand how this co-evolution works if we want to be able to judge our predicament in the Anthropocene and adjust our behaviors, including our knowledge economies, accordingly. From an evolutionary perspective, knowledge is one of the regulatory structures of human behavior, along with other mental and societal structures, such as institutions, all of them conditioned by material conditions. At the same time, human actions externalize these structures in transformations of their material environment. These changes may then again be internalized in human behavior and societal structures. And so one can conceive this evolutionary processes, now I'm talking about cultural evolution, epistemic evolution works on the same principle here, as an interchange between externalization processes, the changes of the environment and our own material context, and an internalization of the resulting changes in knowledge structures, in other mental structures, and societal structures. So that's the way in which I think one can conceptualize these evolutionary processes, taking into account the role of knowledge, which typically hasn't been taken properly into account in cultural evolution. For instance, in the course of the Neolithic evolution, humans have learned to reproduce environmental conditions, allowing them to produce their food. So in other words, some accidental external conditions, such as the local availability of plants and animals, that are capable of being domesticated, they could now be turned into indispensable features of the further global development, accounting for the high past dependency of this process. For instance, if you have read Judd Diamond's book on guns, steel, and germs, you can see, there were some species that you can domesticate, others not. This explains, at least for the onset of this cultural, of these neolithization processes, stark differences between different regions of the Earth. So, in other words, a given physical environment and a material culture open up a specific space of possibilities for the development of regulative structures. The horizon of possibilities shaped by these material conditions is always, and this is a fundamental principle, is always wider than the possibilities actually realized at any given moment, leaving room for exploration. Why not? Concluding. Here it goes. So, repurposing is the theme here. In particular, as the material conditions and external manifestations of human social and behavioral structures play a key role in their regulation, such an exploration will always react back on the societal structures themselves. Exploring the horizon of possibilities offered by our given material culture may end up in a transformation of our societal structures, of our knowledge structures as well. Exploring the possibilities of social organization offered by a particular material culture may engender societal transformations. Needless to stress that neither kind of transformation is ever simple or straightforward, but certainly worthy of deeper investigation from a perspective that covers both the transformation of knowledge and that of society. Just as biological evolution, cultural evolution is an irreversible, singular, and unrepeatable process whose outcomes cannot be predicted. Historically, the accessibility of fossil energy resources was such an accidental local condition fostering the emergence of industrialized societies. In the long run, however, it will not be possible to maintain the conditions it offered for societal development, let alone to reproduce them, because in contrast to the example of the Neolithic Revolution, those external conditions cannot be reproduced, because they take millions of years to reproduce. The seemingly cheap and limitless availability of fossil resources has for a time seemingly decoupled industrialized societies from local environmental conditions. The abundance of energy has decontextualized the regulative structures of these societies, suggesting that they have an actually universal character. That is, that they can be in principle superimposed on arbitrary local conditions and projected into an indefinite future. Now the time for such a local universalism is over. The consequences of industrialization restitute a regulatory function to the environment on a global scale that will affect human behavior and societal structures, albeit in locally diverse forms. The inevitable transformation of fossil fuel-based societies will have to be an exploratory process as well, because locally different conditions will again become increasingly relevant. There will not be a one-size-fits-all solution. Future solutions to energy problems, for instance, will no longer be able to deal with technical systems independently from local and global environmental and societal conditions. A new knowledge economy will have to be based on the perspective of global contextualism, paying attention to both locally varying context and global consequences of any human intervention in the Earth systems. Therefore, a new knowledge economy will have to deal with the borderline problems at the interface between the human ergosphere and other spheres of the Earth system. And it will have to provide for modes of integrating the legacy of global human knowledge with the new local knowledge emerging at these interfaces. We need, in particular, more knowledge about balances in global dynamic systems and cultural abstractions that help us to maintain or adapt these balances by locally representing them in the lives and minds of human actors. In cultural evolution, the internalization and reproduction of given external conditions within societal development was largely a matter of circumstance. In epistemic evolution, it will have to become more and more a matter of knowledge. The sense of urgency, driven by the awareness that we are living in the Anthropocene, should thus not just concern politics and economy, but also the quest for more knowledge and the right kind of knowledge that may trigger cross-scale effects of human behavior. Qui chiudo la mia relazione e vi ringrazio nuovamente per questa splendida occasione di incontro e per l'onore che mi avete fatto consegnandomi la medaglia Commandiniana. Essa resterà per me per sempre segno di una lunga amicizia e fedeltà, caro ricordo della comune passione per la conoscenza, per la condivisione dei saperi, per l'amicizia tra i nostri popoli e le nostre istituzioni. Grazie di cuore.
Grazie al professor Jürgen Renn per questo contributo brillante, davvero stimolante, che ci fa riflettere su quello che sarà il nostro futuro e che ci costringe a riflettere. Io credo che ci saranno delle domande, io credo che Jürgen sarà disponibile. Prego.
Einstein has two quotes which I think are relevant to your presentation. The first is his description of knowledge as a sphere. And he said, as the sphere containing human knowledge increases, so does the boundary with the unknown. The second quote has to do with atomic energy. He said, the splitting of the atom changes everything, except the way humans think. When you put these two quotes together, it suggests that the more knowledge we have, the greater the epistemologic risk to people. And for those unfamiliar with epistemologic risk, it is hazards to humans that result from thinking we understand something when in truth we don't. An example here in Italy might be thinking we understand how earthquakes are generated, and yet sometimes that belief tricks us into thinking we are safe when we are not. The second part of this introduction to my question relates to your comment that during the acceleration post-war, there was an acceleration of production of information and knowledge and population, uncontrolled. You refer to it as a positive feedback, self-enhancing feedback. But later in your presentation, you suggest that knowledge is a self-regulating mechanism. Did I misunderstand? Okay. So my question, therefore, is, does the production of knowledge safeguard human society, or is it substantially neutral and does not produce any more safeguard than we had previously?
Thank you very much for this beautiful question and the beautiful quotations by which you introduced your question. And let me try to freely answer to them. First of all, as for the sphere of knowledge, unfortunately, it's not a sphere. It's also not. It's neither neutral nor homogeneous, because knowledge is owned. We should not forget that. There is public knowledge, of course, but there is also privatized knowledge. There is some call it dark knowledge, secret knowledge, knowledge that is not in the open. So knowledge has, and I insisted on this in my lecture, not just a cognitive component, because the sphere is again such a Platonic image. It has a strongly social and economic dimension as well. And so it's kind of an illusion that we are already living in a knowledge sphere. And the second point is, does the nuclear change all but not the way we produce knowledge? Not really, and there it brings me immediately to your conclusion that knowledge may be neutral. So I think by and large, at least in the German public discourse, we have come to the conclusion that it's not a good idea to proceed with nuclear energy production because of the risks that you mentioned. So this is kind of our earthquake, our artificially made earthquake risk, if you wish. Still, we have to live with the legacy. We have to live with the nuclear waste and the problem where to put it. And we have to care for it for generations. And this is not just a political question, for thousands of years we have to require a stability of society taking care of this problem, but we have to also transmit the knowledge. So is that saying that knowledge is neutral? No, I think it's highly path dependent. Knowledge is in two senses path dependent. One is because we have produced an environment, say nuclear energy, or the kind of size of humanity that we have also produced, enhancing our agricultural methods by chemical fertilizers and so on and so forth. So we have produced a predicament, and now more or less we have to try to deal with it. And certain knowledge is just, I'm sorry for the word, self-replicating like a cancer, because it's produced as part of a market mechanism. And other knowledge may be needed and is not equally fast produced because it's needed to solve those problems, to address this problem. So in this sense, I think knowledge is highly political because we have to determine its social structures. And everything that has a social structure, by definition, is a political theme. So, it's true, what is sometimes said, there is a lot of knowledge that is just now being implemented politically. That's also true. But the converse conclusion that all knowledge is already there to solve our problem is certainly wrong. It's a wrong inversion of this inference. So we need both. We need to fight for the implementation of the relevant knowledge and to extract it from some of the dark corners, and we need to solve some fundamental problems of humanity. I don't want to go into details, but I could. That is not automatically produced by the existing knowledge institutions, neither the private ones nor the public ones. So thank you again for your question.
Qualche altra domanda? Vincenzo?
Thank you very much, Jürgen, for your very beautiful conference. I wonder which role, if any, plays the concept of reality and realism in your framework. That it's clear that our knowledge is deeply influenced by society. The formation of our concept are also influenced by what happened in reality, from technological problems, practical problems, so on. But it's clear also that the results of our experiments depend on nature, and so probably making science, we acquire some information about the environment around us, and so in certain sense realism is one of the aims of science. And it is a very difficult framework, it's a very difficult situation in which we now are, that is the Anthropocene, that is destruction of the planet. What do you think that this aim of knowledge, the aim of science is important and plays some role, or you think that it's something secondary?
So thank you again for this really helpful question. Given there are so many social constraints, contexts, factors that play a role, some of our colleagues in the history and sociology of science have come to think that reality is just a construct, and we should primarily look at those social mechanisms. But I think they forget two dimensions of the three dimensions of knowledge that I have underlined. One is the material dimension, which has a close contact to the reality, the material reality, and the other is the cognitive dimensions. Many of our colleagues who speak of this social construction of science and technology forget that this has to do something with human thinking as well. And I fully agree with you that forgetting those two components, namely our efforts to grasp reality and the supposition there is a material reality, makes science, in this particular view, a merely scholastic or a merely political enterprise. Whereas we should not forget that science strives for the cognition of reality, and I try to frame it in the definition of knowledge as an attempt to solve our problems in this reality. Now these problems, what are these problems, may leave a lot of room for culturally different or socially different perspectives. But I mean, ultimately there is a difference between some mental construct that is aimed at solving a problem and other mental construct that that do not solve problems but that have other functions in our behavior. So I still think there is room for boundaries between knowledge and non-knowledge, between scientific knowledge and non-scientific knowledge. But these boundaries are themselves part of our historical reality. They are not just socially constructed, but they have been evolving in our historical reality. So I think, one is always tempted within these strongly ideologically shaped debates to simplify and to oversimplify. And this is what I meant by saying we need to keep balances. And it's sometimes very hard to keep balances. And not forgetting about the role of reality is an important reminder that these balances are necessary. It reminds me of Sigmund Freud, if I may cite an unusual witness for the importance of reality, and his idea that keeping in mind the principle of reality is an important factor in maintaining an individual psychological balance, and I think the same holds for society.
Prego.
I think that okay, thank you very much for your very interesting conference. My question is about a problem. I was thinking about the problem of the digital divide, and so the question is, who has to produce this knowledge for our future? Digital divide is a problem, but also different religion traditions, for example, are a problem, because we know that for the production of the cultural background, also in science, different religion and cultural traditions are very a difficult point for having a unique framework inside which producing science, for example. So, who has to produce the knowledge for this future, for our future? How we can innate an interaction between different traditions in our historical knowledge and scientific knowledge? Because I think that this is a very problematic point. Thank you.
I agree, and I have no solution. This is my easy answer. But I'm sure which solutions won't work, because we have some historical experiences that it will not work, that something that we produced in Europe or in the US or in Australia can simply be transmitted and then drive the necessary changes. This clearly will not work, because this world has other traditions, and it also has other problems. Question of political control, of religious fundamentalism, and all of these problems. But in the end, my hope is, or at least it's not so much a hope, it's the realization that knowledge is this social process that doesn't have simple structures like sender and receiver structures, but that needs to be co-produced. And if this knowledge, in my view, certainly needed to cope with the challenges of the Anthropocene, is not co-produced, it will not mobilize enough social, intellectual resources to actually achieve its goal. So it cannot be solved by a small minority. It's not. So, for instance, Paul Crutzen himself, I mentioned Paul Crutzen as the originator of the concept of the Anthropocene. Of course, he himself, driven by the urgency and his experience, that he discovered the ozone hole and started a political process that saved all our lives. This one little thing, because if the ozone hole wouldn't have been closed, we would all suffer from heavy cosmic radiation and all suffer from cancer. Not just we as humans, but so there's this is about the risk and the fragility that you mentioned earlier. But then he came to the thinking, we need to do geoengineering. And he earned a lot of protest, because this is a very pretentious proposition that now a small number of scientists and engineers take responsibility for the entire planet and devise mechanisms like spreading sulfur in the atmosphere to save us from global warming. I think this is a very risky thinking. So that's the dilemma in which we are. This is the one extreme, and the other extreme is let's first fight all those wars for social justice and then we may no longer have the time to solve those problems. So I have no answers. My answer to your question.
Bene, grazie. Ci sono altre domande? Allora ancora grazie. Un'ultima domanda. The last question.
Getting back to your use of the word systems and feedback, because humanity is not isotropic, not homogeneous, would you comment on what you think the positive self-enhancing feedback loops are in this information-producing system, and what the self-regulating feedback mechanisms are in this system that you described?
That's a tall order, of course. The specific feedback mechanism to which I once referred was at the beginning of capitalist economy in the early modern times, and then in the Industrial Revolution, where knowledge became a factor of economic efficiency. And here I see a new link being established between knowledge produced and economic development. And this certainly is a feedback that still works today, as you can see. Even firms now have laboratories and invest in science and so on. So here knowledge and capitalist production are certainly in a feedback loop. Whether there are sort of feedback loops that help us solve these problems, I'm not so sure. They are not, they don't easily emerge by themselves. I think, you know, establishing the needed feedback loops may be only the result of political action. So there's nothing, say, intrinsic, systemic about these feedback loops, I believe.
Bene, allora grazie. Esperto di tante cose, ma di comandino, questo è il legame più forte con la nostra università, con questa città, e quindi siamo veramente molto molto lieti di continuare questa grande collaborazione. Grazie. Grazie.